On the frozen morning of January 27, 1955, the heartbeat of Manhattan's elite shifted. At 814 Fifth Avenue, a 6-story neoclassical limestone mansion stood as a monument to excess, its facade carved with the cold precision of the Gilded Age. Inside, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic oscillation of a grandfather clock in the foyer. William Morter, the butler, began his ascent. His shoes, polished to a mirror sheen, sank into the pile of a 17th-century Isfahan Persian rug, a hand-knotted masterpiece where every square inch contained over 800 individual knots. He passed walls adorned with French Regency boiserie, hand-carved oak panels stripped from European chateaux and reassembled for a man who believed history could be bought and reinstalled. When Morter reached the third-floor master suite, he found the door unlocked. The room smelled of Carvin's Magritte, a sharp, floral fragrance that cost $15 an ounce in 1955, roughly $175 today. On the bed lay Serge Rubinstein. The most hated man in Wall Street was positioned face down, his body a pale contrast against the deep navy blue of his shantung silk pajamas. His wrists and ankles were not merely tied. They were lashed with the cold efficiency of a nautical knot using white cotton Venetian blind cords. These cords, a staple of 1950s interior utility, were rated for a tensile strength of 80 pounds, yet they bit into the flesh of a man worth millions. His mouth was sealed with a 3-inch strip of industrial-grade silver adhesive tape, a rubber-based pressure-sensitive tape originally developed for sealing ammunition cases during the war. There was no blood. There was no struggle. Only the silent testimony of a professional execution. The mansion itself was a fortress of fiscal sovereignty. Rubinstein had purchased the lease for approximately $150,000, a figure that translates to a staggering $1.8 million in 2026 purchasing power, with annual maintenance costs exceeding $250,000 in modern currency. The interior was a technical marvel of its time, featuring a private elevator with gold leaf gatework and a reinforced steel walk-in safe hidden behind a false library shelf. Detectives from the 19th Precinct, led by the stoic Inspector James J. Leggett, noted the absence of forced entry. The 4 high-security deadbolts on the front door, manufactured by Yale & Town with paracentric keyways designed to resist pick tools, were found intact. This suggested the killers either possessed a duplicated key or, more chillingly, were invited in. Forensic technology in 1955 was transitioning. Investigators utilized the silver nitrate method for developing latent fingerprints on porous surfaces like the silk pajamas, though the results were obscured by the fine weave of the fabric. The room contained a collection of gold-cased clocks, each meticulously synchronized. On the nightstand sat a bottle of barbiturates and a private telephone line, a direct link to the brokerage houses of Lower Manhattan. Outside, the temperature hovered at 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The 1955 economy was booming under Eisenhower, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average flirting with the 400-point mark for the first time, yet inside 814 Fifth Avenue, the dividends of a lifetime of greed had finally matured into a singular, terminal debt. The victim was a man who had survived the collapse of the Russian Empire and the purges of European finance, yet he was undone by 2 yards of window cord. As the sun rose over Central Park, illuminating the crystal perfume bottles on the vanity, the police began a daunting task. They were not looking for a needle in a haystack. They were looking for a specific killer within a database of over 2,000 documented enemies. Serge Rubinstein had spent years collecting names of those he had ruined, but he failed to realize that every name was a potential architect of his end. For the New York police, the challenge was not finding someone with a motive, but rather filtering a list of 2,000 individuals who had every reason to pull the cord. The predatory instinct of Serge Rubinstein was not acquired in the boardrooms of New York, but in the aristocratic bloodbath of St. Petersburg. He was born in 1908 into a world of inconceivable structural wealth. His father, Dmitry Rubinstein, was a financial titan of the Russian Imperial Bank and a clandestine fiscal advisor to the Tsarist court. Dmitry was the man who managed the logistics of the Romanovs' private liquidity, operating in the shadow of Grigory Rasputin. The technicality of Russian banking in 1910 was a labyrinth of gold-backed rubles and complex land titles held by the nobility. One imperial gold coin, the 10-ruble fascinates, contained 7.74 grams of pure gold. In today's market, the gold content alone would be worth nearly $600 per coin, and Dmitry Rubinstein moved them by the thousands. In October 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution dismantled this reality in a matter of weeks. As the Red Guard seized the banks, the Rubinstein family activated a contingency plan rooted in material portability. Serge, then a child of 9, watched as his mother, Stella, and a team of trusted servants utilized high-gauge steel needles and waxed linen thread to sew over $200,000 worth of diamonds and emeralds into the silk linings of their heavy fur coats. In 1917, $200,000 was a fortune capable of buying a small city. In 2026, those assets would represent a liquid value of over $5.5 million. This was the boy's first lesson. The only true law is the law of survival, and wealth is only valuable if it can be moved across a hostile border in the dead of night. The family's escape was a masterpiece of logistical evasion. They fled through Finland to Stockholm, utilizing forged Swedish passports that cost Dmitry a small portion of his remaining gold reserves. By the time they reached Paris in 1919, the Rubinsteins were among the few white Russian exiles who were not destitute. While the former generals of the Tsar were driving taxis in the streets of Paris, Serge was being groomed for the next phase of his ascension. The education of a financier in the 1920s was a rigorous process. Serge was sent to King's College, Cambridge in 1928. The tuition and living expenses at Cambridge at the time amounted to roughly $300 per year, which, when adjusted for the purchasing power of the British pound and the subsequent dollar conversion, equates to nearly $65,000 today per semester. At Cambridge, Rubinstein did not study ethics. He studied the mechanics of arbitrage and the vulnerabilities of the gold standard. He was a student under the shadow of the Great Depression, witnessing the 1929 market crash from the safety of the English ivory towers. He analyzed the failure of the Creditanstalt in Austria and the subsequent collapse of European credit. He saw how the 1931 abandonment of the gold standard by Britain created a vacuum in the currency markets. He began to experiment with short selling, the technical process of borrowing an asset, selling it at a high price, and buying it back after the price drops. This was a zero-sum game that required the nerves of a gambler and the precision of an engineer. Serge graduated with honors, but he remained a man without a country. He was an apatride, a stateless person. He traveled on a Nansen passport, a document issued by the League of Nations for refugees who had no government to protect them. This status was the final component of his psychological armor. Because no country claimed him, he felt no loyalty to any flag or any set of national laws. He viewed the world as a series of disconnected jurisdictions to be exploited. He was a brilliant, highly educated predator who understood that while the masses were focused on rebuilding a broken world, the real power lay in the cracks between the nations. Serge had learned early that laws are merely boundaries for the weak, and he intended to be the man who operated in the infinite space where no law reached. By 1932, the financial lungs of the world were gasping for air, but in the fog-thickened streets of London City, Serge Rubinstein found the oxygen of opportunity. The British pound had recently decoupled from the gold standard, a move that sent tremors through the global exchange markets. For an arbitrageur, this volatility was a playground. Serge, operating out of a modest office near the Royal Exchange, turned his predatory gaze toward the chosen Semenoff mining syndicate. This was a complex corporate entity with mining concessions in Korea, then under the iron grip of the Japanese Empire. The technical reality of chosen Semenoff was a labyrinth of undervalued assets and forgotten shareholders. Rubinstein didn't care about the gold in the ground. He cared about the paper in the vaults. He utilized a sophisticated technique of wash sales, a mechanical manipulation where he acted as both buyer and seller through a network of Swiss and French shell companies to create an artificial illusion of market liquidity. The London Stock Exchange of the 1930s operated on a system of fortnightly settlements. This 2-week window allowed a gambler like Serge to move massive blocks of stock without having the immediate cash to back them. He exploited the contango market, a technical term for when the future price of a commodity is higher than the spot price, to hide his leverage. He formed the Franco-Asiatic Bank in Paris as a primary vehicle for these maneuvers. The bank was a facade, a corporate ghost designed to absorb liabilities while funneling profits into private accounts. In 1933, Serge executed his masterstroke. He gained control of chosen Semenov and proceeded to water the stock. This involved issuing millions of new shares against the same physical assets, diluting the value for every other holder while he siphoned off the initial capital. By the time the British authorities realized the gold mines in Korea were producing more paper than ore, Rubinstein had pocketed his first £1,000,000. In 2026, this $1,000 represents a staggering purchasing power of approximately $135 million. The macroeconomic context of 1933 was one of desperate protectionism. The World Economic Conference in London had just failed, and nations were retreating into currency blocks. Serge thrived in this fragmentation. While the average Londoner lived on less than $3 a week, barely $400 a month today, Serge was frequenting the most exclusive tailors of Savile Row. He commissioned suits made of 13-ounce wool flannel, costing $20 each, the equivalent of $20,700 today. He was often seen at the Carlton Club, engaging in the performative etiquette of the British upper class, though his status as a Nansen passport holder made him a permanent outsider. His primary rival during this period was Sir William Firth, a titan of the British steel industry. Firth represented the old guard of industrial capital, men who built factories and employed thousands. Rubinstein represented the new guard of nomadic capital, men who built nothing and employed only lawyers. The logistics of his scams required a constant stream of telegrams between London, Paris, and Tokyo. A single urgent rate cablegram from London to Tokyo in 1934 cost 3 shillings per word, about $22 per word today. Serge spent thousands on these communications, ensuring his shell companies moved in perfect, untraceable synchronicity. He understood that the speed of information was the ultimate multiplier of wealth. He began to acquire a taste for the golden lifestyle, purchasing a 1934 Rolls-Royce Phantom II. The vehicle featured a 7.7-liter straight-six engine and a custom body by Barker & Coleman. The price tag of $2,500 would equate to roughly $340,000 in modern currency. He was a millionaire before his 26th birthday, but he was also a marked man. The British Board of Trade began a quiet but exhaustive investigation into his chosen dealings, and the Japanese government grew weary of a stateless Russian manipulating assets in their territory. But London started to feel small for a man whose ambitions required a stage where greed was celebrated and not just tolerated. In 1938, as the shadows of the Third Reich lengthened over Europe, Serge Rubinstein boarded the SS Normandy, the pinnacle of French maritime engineering. The ship was a floating palace of Art Deco, powered by 4 massive turbo-electric engines producing 160,000 horsepower. Serge traveled in a grand luxe suite, which featured a private dining room and individual servant quarters. The ticket alone cost the equivalent of $45,000 in 2026 currency. He carried with him over $1 million in transferable securities and a suitcase filled with detailed dossiers on American mid-cap industrial firms. His destination was Wall Street, but his method was the corporate raid, a strategy so ruthless it would take the American legal system decades to categorize it. His primary target was the Panhandle Producing and Refining Company, a Texas-based oil firm with aging equipment but a massive, untouched cash reserve. The technical execution of the Panhandle raid was a masterclass in proxy warfare. In 1940, SEC regulations were in their infancy, having only been established 6 years prior. Rubinstein exploited the proxy statement loophole. He didn't try to buy the whole company. He only needed 25% plus one share to effectively seize control of the board. He launched a smear campaign against the existing management, accusing them of fiscal stagnation, while secretly buying up blocks of shares through his panhandle producing and refining company subsidiaries. Once he forced his way onto the board, he fired the veteran engineers and replaced them with his own accountants. The logistics of oil refining in 1940 were shifting from thermal cracking to the more efficient catalytic cracking process. Instead of investing the company's $5 million treasury, $110 million today, into these necessary upgrades, Serge loaned the money to his own offshore shell companies at 0% interest. The macroeconomic climate of 1940 was defined by the U.S. transition to a war economy. The Neutrality Acts were being bypassed by the Lend-Lease program, and industrial production was skyrocketing. While the American public was focused on the fall of France, Serge was focused on the liquidation of assets. He sold off Panhandle's auxiliary pipelines and storage tanks to competitors, recording the transactions as consulting fees to avoid corporate tax. By 1941, his personal fortune had surged to an estimated $10 million. Roughly $225 million today. He moved into a penthouse at the Ritz Tower on Park Avenue, paying a monthly rent that would equate to $32,000 in modern terms. He was a frequent guest at the Stork Club, sitting at table 50, where he rubbed shoulders with figures like J. Edgar Hoover and columnist Walter Winchell. Yet he remained an alien. During this period, Serge's legal counsel was a revolving door of the most expensive talent money could buy. He briefly utilized the services of lawyers linked to the powerful Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, seeking to understand the intersection of legitimate finance and unregulated street capital. Serge was fascinated by the technicality of skimming, how to remove cash from a business before it was ever recorded in the ledgers. He applied this to Panhandle's payroll, creating ghost employees and redirecting their wages into his private travel fund. This was an era of pneumatic tubes in banks and manual ticker tape, where a clever man could hide a transaction in the physical delay of the system. He was the predator of Wall Street, but an event global was about to demand a tribute that the money of Serge did not want to pay. As the drums of war grew louder, the U.S. government began to look closely at the young, stateless millionaire who was draining American industrial reserves while refusing to contribute to the national defense. He was the perfect predator of Wall Street, but a global event was about to demand a tribute that the money of Serge did not want to pay. The acquisition of 814 Fifth Avenue in 1952 was not merely a real estate transaction. It was a tactical seizure of a sovereign limestone territory. The mansion, a 6-story neoclassical structure designed by the architectural firm of J.E.R. Carpenter, stood as a relic of an era when Fifth Avenue was defined by the Astors and the Vanderbilts. Built with Indiana limestone, a Mississippian-age grainstone prized for its durability and 15% porosity, the facade was designed to resist the sulfuric acid erosion typical of mid-century Manhattan smog. Serge Rubinstein secured the leasehold for the mansion from the estate of the late Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The cost of such a lease in the early 1950s was approximately $150,000, which in 2026 currency commands a purchasing power of $1,250,000. To maintain this 15,000 square foot fortress, Rubinstein employed a domestic staff of 7, including a butler, a cook, and multiple housemen. The annual payroll for a staff of this caliber, adjusted for 2026 wages and specialized domestic labor markets, would exceed $620,000. The interior was a study in material provenance and technical ostentation. The grand ballroom featured Louis XV de boiserie, which had been chemically analyzed and restored to preserve the original 18th century gold leaf. Rubinstein insisted on a specific thermal environment. The mansion was retrofitted with an early model central HVAC system utilizing R12 refrigerant, dichloro-difluoromethane, a compound later banned for its ozone-depleting properties, but then considered the pinnacle of climate control. He spent over $100,000, roughly $1.2 million today, on the installation of concealed steel shutters and a reinforced master suite. The security apparatus was advanced for 1952, featuring a series of magnetic contact sensors on the windows and a private direct-line telephone exchange that bypassed the standard municipal switchboard. This ensured his conversations with brokers in Zurich and Tangier remained unmonitored by the nascent industrial espionage units of his rivals. Rubinstein's lifestyle was an inventory of excessive consumption. His wardrobe contained over 400 hand-sewn silk ties, primarily from Charvet in Paris and Sulka in New York. A single silk tie from these houses in 1954 cost $15, equivalent to $185 today. His fleet of vehicles included a 1952 Cadillac Series 75 Fleetwood limousine, powered by a 331 cubic inch overhead valve V8 engine, producing 190 horsepower. The vehicle's curb weight of 5,300 pounds required specialized heavy-duty suspension, a technical detail Rubinstein demanded to ensure a silent ride over New York's cobblestone remains. His maritime asset, the Nam Sang, was a 90-foot luxury yacht equipped with twin six-cylinder diesel engines and a hull constructed of double-planked mahogany. Maintaining such a vessel in the 1950s required a permanent crew of 3 and a monthly slip fee in the Hudson River that would equate to $8,500 in modern currency. The culinary logistics of the mansion were equally precise. Rubinstein consumed beluga caviar imported directly from the Caspian Sea, which at the time was graded by the size of the sturgeon roe, Zeroelzohaldiduns being the largest and most expensive. He insisted on using mother-of-pearl spoons to prevent the metallic oxidation of the eggs, a chemical reaction that alters the flavor profile of the lipids. His wine cellar contained over 2,000 bottles, featuring vertical vintages of Chateau Lafite Rothschild and Chateau Mouton Rothschild from the 1920s. The macroeconomic context of the early 1950s was one of post-war surplus and the beginning of the consumer republic. While the average American family was moving to Levittown and purchasing $10,000 homes, Rubinstein was spending that same amount annually just on floral arrangements and dry cleaning. However, the mansion was more than a home. It was a psychological fortification. As his legal troubles mounted and his reputation as a financial pariah solidified, the 814 Fifth Avenue address became his primary defense. He spent his evenings surrounded by 17th century tapestries and Ming Dynasty porcelain, artifacts of civilizations that had collapsed under their own weight. He was a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing, residing in a museum of his own greed. By 1954, the internal atmosphere of the mansion shifted from one of celebration to one of siege. Behind the hand-carved oak panels and the reinforced steel, Serge Rubinstein began to install a new series of double bolt locks and a silent alarm system. He had spent his life accumulating assets, but he was now accumulating something else. A pervasive, incurable fear that no amount of Indiana limestone could keep at bay. The social identity of Serge Rubinstein was a carefully engineered artifice designed to project the image of a continental playboy while masking the machinations of a corporate insurgent. In 1941, he married Alice Wood, a 19-year-old model for the prestigious Powers Agency. The Powers Agency was the technical precursor to the modern modeling industry, categorizing women by photogenic symmetry and social utility. The wedding was a logistical triumph of the New York social season, held at the St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue, a Byzantine Romanesque masterpiece. Rubinstein provided Alice with a jewelry dowry that included a 10-carat emerald-cut diamond ring and a double-strand Cartier pearl necklace. In 1941, this collection was valued at $75,000. Today, its appraised value in the high-end estate market would exceed $1.8 million. Despite the outward appearance of a power couple, the marriage was governed by a series of draconian prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. Rubinstein's legal team, led by the astute and expensive Edwin Chinlund, drafted contracts of servitude that dictated Alice's public behavior, her caloric intake, and her access to communal funds. These documents utilized liquidated damages clauses, a technical legal mechanism that allowed Serge to reclaim assets if Alice violated any terms of the social contract. This was not a partnership of affection, but a merger of assets. Alice was his social entry permit into the restricted circles of the New York 400, the elite social register that had previously shunned him as a stateless opportunist. Precisely to maintain this mask, Serge frequented the El Morocco and the Stork Club, spending upwards of $500 per night, equivalent to $6,200 today, to secure Siberia proof tables where he could be seen by gossip columnists like Dorothy Kilgallen. The macroeconomic reality of the post-war social scene was defined by the Bretton Woods Agreement and the stabilization of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Rubinstein exploited this stability by creating social syndicates. He would invite prominent figures such as the exiled King Peter II of Yugoslavia and various minor European royals to his mansion for lavish dinners. The technical objective of these gatherings was influence arbitrage. By providing liquidity and luxury to impoverished aristocrats, Serge obtained their endorsement for his dubious business ventures. He was particularly adept at using leveraged socializing, the practice of using a high-profile guest to attract investors to a private room where he would then pitch a new, unregulated stock offering. His guests were fed 12-course meals featuring ortolan and white truffles, while Serge calculated the yield of each person at the table. Rubinstein's secondary characters included figures like Betty the Body, Brosmer, and other rising starlets of the era. He utilized a gift and control strategy, providing these women with expensive furs, specifically Russian sable and American mink, which in the 1950s functioned as a form of portable currency. A high-quality sable coat cost $5,000 in 1953, representing $62,000 in 2026 value. However, these gifts often remained in Serge's name, allowing him to revoke them at a moment's notice to ensure loyalty. His social mask was maintained by a relentless schedule of appearances at charity galas for organizations like the March of Dimes, where he would make highly publicized donations while simultaneously shorting the stocks of the companies that sponsored the events. This was the era of the man in the gray flannel suit, a period of rigid social conformity that Serge manipulated with the precision of a master locksmith. Beneath the surface of the champagne and the silk, the reality of Rubinstein's partnerships was one of absolute predation. He did not have friends. He had temporary strategic allies. His contracts for business partners often included call options on their personal property and cross-default clauses that tied their financial survival to his own whims. He was viewed by the old money establishment, families whose wealth was generated by the 19th century railroads and steel, as a vulgar alien. They recognized the technical proficiency of his scams but despised the transparency of his greed. By 1955, his marriage to Alice had collapsed into a series of bitter lawsuits, and his social invitations had begun to dry up. The mask was cracking, and the man who had successfully deceived the global markets was about to discover that public opinion in a nation hardened by war was a force that could not be bribed or liquidated. The geopolitical machinery of 1944 was a voracious consumer of manpower, operated through the technical framework of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. This legislation was the first peacetime conscription in United States history, requiring all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for the Great Lottery of National Defense. Classifications were binary and ruthless. 1A signified immediate availability for combat, while 4F denoted physical or mental unfitness. For Serge Rubinstein, a man who viewed sovereignty as a liquid asset, the prospect of an infantryman's salary, roughly $50 per month or $950 in 2026 purchasing power, was not merely a financial insult, but a strategic failure. As the 101st Airborne prepared for the invasion of Normandy, Rubinstein initiated a logistical campaign of evasion that would cost him over $500,000 in legal fees and bribes, an expenditure equivalent to $9.4 million today. The technical core of Rubinstein's evasion rested on the manipulation of occupational deferment and dependency claims. Under Section 5K of the Act, an individual could be deferred if their presence in a domestic industry was essential to the national health, safety, or interest. Rubinstein argued that his management of the Panhandle Producing and Refining Company was critical for the production of aviation fuel. He utilized high-precision corporate auditing to manufacture reports that exaggerated the company's output of 100-octane gasoline, the fuel required for the Allison V1710 engines used in P-38 Lightnings. The logistics of fuel production in 1944 were governed by the Petroleum Administration for War, which monitored the tetraethyl lead additives used to prevent engine knocking. Rubinstein's engineers were instructed to falsify these technical specifications to justify his irreplaceable status. When the Selective Service Board 17 in Manhattan reclassified him as 1A, Rubinstein pivoted to the neutral alien loophole. He had secured a Portuguese visa through a series of offshore transactions involving the Banco Espírito Santo in Lisbon, a maneuver that cost him approximately $25,000 in 1943 currency, roughly $475,000 today. Under the law, a citizen of a neutral country could request relief from military service, but doing so would permanently bar them from ever attaining U.S. citizenship. Rubinstein signed the Form 301, the technical document of alienage, believing that his $10 million fortune would provide a permanent shield against the consequences of statelessness. The macroeconomic context of the era was one of total war, where the social contract was enforced by the Office of War Information through intense patriotic propaganda. In this climate, a millionaire dodging the draft was not just a legal problem. It was a cultural provocation. The legal battle escalated to the halls of the Department of Justice. Rubinstein's primary rival was U.S. Attorney John F.X. McGaughey, a man whose career was built on the technical prosecution of organized crime and subversion. The trial centered on the material misrepresentation of Rubinstein's dependency claims. He had asserted that his wife Alice and his daughters were entirely dependent on his presence, while simultaneously filing for a legal separation and moving his assets into blind trusts in Panama. The court utilized the 1940s stenotype machines, which used a phonetic corded keyboard to record 200 words per minute on paper ribbons. These ribbons documented a narrative of a man who viewed the American flag as a flag of convenience. In 1947, the technicality of the law finally caught up with him. He was charged with draft evasion by fraudulent means, a felony under the Selective Service Act. For the American public, Serge Rubinstein became the definitive draft dodger, a symbol of the cowardice that wealth could buy but never fully protect. The logistical cost of his defense included a revolving door of 15 senior attorneys and 22 investigators, whose daily retainers would equate to $12,000 in modern currency. Despite the expenditure, the evidence of his falsified dependency was overwhelming. The judge, citing the egregious nature of the fraud during a period of national peril, sentenced Rubinstein to 2.5 years in federal prison. He was also fined $50,000, roughly $27,000 today, the maximum penalty allowed by law. As he was led from the courtroom, the silk of his suit clashing with the cold steel of the handcuffs, the man who had outmaneuvered Wall Street was introduced to the uncompromising architecture of the federal penal system. For the first time, the walls of his mansion at 814 Fifth Avenue were not high enough to keep the justice of a war-hardened nation at bay. In 1947, Serge Rubinstein was transported to the United States Penitentiary, Lewisburg, in Pennsylvania. This facility was a technical masterpiece of big house prison architecture designed in the 1930s by the firm of Alfred Hopkins and Associates. Modeled after the Tower of London, it featured a panopticon layout within a Gothic Revival exterior, utilizing reinforced concrete walls 20 feet high and a complex system of underground utility tunnels. The logistics of inmate processing were designed for the systematic stripping of individuality. Rubinstein's silk pajamas were replaced by a denim work uniform, and his name was replaced by a 5-digit inmate number. The technicality of his incarceration was defined by the rule of silence during meals and the 6-8 a.m. head count, where his survival now depended on a bunkmate rather than a board of directors. Lewisburg was not a typical prison. It was the country club for the American underworld and high-finance criminals. During his tenure, Rubinstein walked the same corridors as mob boss Frank Costello and various leaders of the Murder Income Syndicate. The macroeconomic reality of prison life was governed by the cigarette standard. With the U.S., dollar physically removed from circulation within the walls, a pack of Lucky Strikes, costing 15 cents outside, became the primary unit of account for protection, food, and information. Rubinstein, ever the financier, quickly realized that the technical mechanics of arbitrage could be applied even to a prison yard. He traded his allotted premium rations and commissary credits to secure the favor of the Italian-American factions, effectively purchasing a protective detail of 3 inmates for the price of 2 cartons of cigarettes a week. Despite his physical confinement, Rubinstein's corporate empire did not cease to function. It merely evolved into a telephonic insurgency. The logistics of 1940s prison communication allowed for limited, monitored phone calls. Rubinstein utilized a prearranged numerical code to transmit buy and sell orders to his brokers in New York. A sentence about his mother's health was a technical instruction to liquidate his position in North American oil, while a question about the weather in Paris directed the purchase of gold bullion on the London market. He was running a multi-million-dollar hedge fund from a payphone in a concrete hallway. The prison guards, whose salaries averaged $2,800 per year, roughly $40,000 today, were often susceptible to the logistics of subornation. Rubinstein allegedly spent thousands through third parties to ensure his mail remained unread and his telephone time was extended. The technicality of his legal battle continued from his cell. His lawyers filed over 20 appeals based on habeas corpus and jurisdictional disputes. The cost of this litigation from within exceeded $250,000, or $3.6 million in 2026 value. He was also fighting a deportation order issued by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. Under the Immigration Act of 1917, an alien convicted of a crime of moral turpitude could be forcibly removed from the United States. Rubinstein's defense was built on the technical status of his Nansen passport and the fact that the Soviet Union refused to recognize him as a citizen. He was, quite literally, a man whom no country on earth was legally required to accept. This created a judicial limbo, where the U.S. government could convict him, but could not find a destination for his exile. Rubinstein was released in 1949, having served 2 years. He returned to Manhattan not as a reformed citizen, but as a marked predator. He had gained 15 pounds from the high-carbohydrate prison diet of potatoes and bread, and his hair had turned a premature silver. The 1949 economy was in a minor recession, but the stock market was beginning its historic post-war bull run. Rubinstein immediately resumed his operations at 814 Fifth Avenue, but the atmosphere had changed. He was now a person non grata at the Stork Club, and his name was synonymous with betrayal. He had survived Louisburg, but he had lost the most important asset in high finance, the illusion of legitimacy. He returned to his mansion and discovered that he was now the primary target in a season of hunt that had no rules, where his enemies were no longer limited to the courtroom. By 1953, the internal landscape of 814 Fifth Avenue had transformed into a command center for private espionage. Serge Rubinstein, now operating with the hypervigilance of a man under permanent siege, began the systematic compilation of what investigators would later call the List of 2000. This was a meticulous card index system housed in a fireproof steel cabinet, categorized by the technical nature of his grievance with each individual. The list included former business partners liquidated in the Panhandle raid, husbands of women he had seduced, and high-ranking officials within the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. Rubinstein understood that in the era of McCarthyism, information was the only currency that could not be devalued. He spent approximately $50,000 annually, roughly $590,000 in 2026 value, on a network of private investigators and disgruntled police informants to keep this database current. The technical apparatus of his surveillance was cutting edge for the early 1950s. He utilized the Webcore 210 wire recorder, a device that captured audio on a spool of stainless steel wire 0.0036 inches in diameter, moving at 24 inches per second. These recordings were often surreptitious, captured via microphones hidden within the ornate plaster moldings of his dining room. The logistics of wiretapping during this period involved the carbon microphone technology, which, while sensitive to vibrations, required a direct electrical current that often created a telltale hum on the line. Rubinstein's technicians developed interference filters to mask this hum, allowing him to record the private conversations of his dinner guests without detection. These recordings were his ultimate dark assets, used as leverage in a series of sophisticated blackmail schemes that kept his enemies at bay. The macroeconomic context of 1952 to 1953 was defined by the McCarran-Walter Act, a piece of legislation that tightened the technical criteria for the deportation of subversive or criminally inclined aliens. For Rubinstein, this law was a direct existential threat. His legal battles against the INS reached the Supreme Court, involving technical disputes over the definition of moral turpitude. The cost of his legal defense during these 2 years alone reached $300,000, which in 2026 purchasing power exceeds $3.5 million. His lead counsel during this phase was the formidable and high-priced lawyer and former judge Samuel Rosenman. Rosenman was a master of constitutional technicality, arguing that because Rubinstein was legally stateless, he could not be deported to any sovereign territory, effectively creating a permanent judicial stay of execution. Rubinstein's secondary characters during this period were increasingly drawn from the shadow economy of New York. He was frequently seen in the company of individuals like Stanley T. Stanley, a shady financier and professional fixer who specialized in the technical movement of unregulated capital. Stanley's role was to act as the bagman for the bribes Rubinstein allegedly paid to avoid deportation. The archive curiosities of their meetings involve the specific etiquette of 1950s underworld negotiation. Meetings were often held in the back rooms of chop houses like Keene's, where the thick smoke of $2 cigars served as a sensory shield against eavesdropping. A dinner for two at such an establishment, including prime rib and premium bourbon, cost $40 in 1953, roughly $475 today, a negligible expense for a man whose daily fluctuations in the oil market could net him $100,000 in a single afternoon. The shadow secret of 814 Fifth Avenue was not just the recordings, but the black ledgers. These were a separate set of books maintained in a secondary safe, detailing the skimmed dividends from his various shell companies. Rubinstein utilized a technical process known as inventory write-downs to artificially deflate the value of his holdings for tax purposes, while simultaneously using those same assets as collateral for massive loans from European banks. By 1954, his paranoia was no longer just a psychological condition. It was a logistical necessity. He began to carry a .25 caliber Beretta Jetfire, a compact semi-automatic pistol with a tip-up barrel design that allowed for easy loading without racking the slide. He was a man who believed that the information he held was his final armor, never suspecting that the very dossiers intended to protect him were actually accelerating the timeline of his demise. By the winter of 1954, the physical and psychological toll of a lifetime of predation had begun to manifest in Serge Rubinstein's physiology. He suffered from chronic insomnia and a pronounced facial tic, a rhythmic twitch of the left orbicularis oculi muscle triggered by acute cortisol spikes. To manage this, his private physician prescribed a regime of Seconal, sodium secobarbital, a powerful barbiturate sedative hypnotic. The pharmacology of Seconal in the 1950s was characterized by a rapid onset and a narrow therapeutic window. An overdose could easily lead to respiratory depression. Rubinstein was taking 100 milliliters dosages, often washed down with 20-year-old Napoleon brandy, a combination that created a state of toxic lethargy, followed by periods of intense, drug-induced paranoia. The security logistics of the mansion at 814 Fifth Avenue reached an extreme level of technical complexity. He contracted ADT, American District Telegraph, to install their latest electromechanical burglar alarm system. This system utilized a series of foil tape circuits applied to the glass panes of every window and door. If the glass was broken, the circuit was interrupted, triggering a signal at the central monitoring station. The monthly monitoring fee and maintenance for such a system in 1954 was $150, roughly $1,750 today. Rubinstein also hired a rotating detail of private bodyguards, often recruited from the ranks of former prize-fighters. However, his pathological inability to trust anyone led to a high turnover rate. On the night of January 26, 1955, he had strangely dismissed his primary bodyguard early, citing a desire for absolute privacy. The macroeconomic climate of January 1955 was one of unprecedented prosperity. The Dow Jones had recently breached the 400-point mark, and the new look policy of the Eisenhower administration had stabilized the post-war economy. While the rest of New York celebrated the dawn of the jet age, Rubinstein was retreating into a technological dark age. He spent his final hours staring at an early model RCA Victor 21-inch black and white television, which utilized the super heterodyne circuit design to process the NTSC signal. The cost of such a television was $300, $3,500 in 2026, but it offered him no comfort. He was a man out of time, an 18th century pirate trapped in a 20th century glass and steel cage. Secondary characters in this final act included his long-suffering butler, William Morter, and his various female associates, who were little more than paid companions. Morter's biography was one of invisible service. He had witnessed the gradual rot of the Rubinstein empire from the inside, managing the logistics of a household where the master was always armed and always afraid. The archive curiosities of the mansion's operation reveal that despite the $35 million fortune, Rubinstein was notoriously short-pocketed with his staff, frequently disputing the cost of groceries and laundry. He would audit the butcher's bill for prime rib, then priced at $0.85 per pound, $10 today, with the same ferocity he used to audit a multi-million-dollar merger. This petty tyranny ensured that by 1955, the only loyalty he possessed was that which he could physically purchase by the hour. The night before the murder, the temperature in Manhattan dropped to a bitter 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The mansion's heating system, a massive oil-fired boiler located in the sub-basement, consumed over 100 gallons of No. 2 heating oil per day, costing approximately $20 per day in 1955, $235 today. The sound of the steam rattling through the cast-iron radiators provided the only soundtrack to his isolation. Rubinstein was seen dining at Nino's Continental Restaurant on East 52nd Street, where he consumed a final meal of steak Diane and a bottle of Petrus. The bill, including a 15% tip, was 45 euros, roughly $530 in modern currency. As he returned to the 814 Fifth Avenue Fortress at midnight, he was observed by a shadow that had been tracking his Cadillac for 3 days. He was a man who had spent his life buying his way out of every corner, but he was about to discover that the only item he could not acquire was a single night of genuine, unmonitored safety. The logistical countdown to the termination of Serge Rubinstein began at 12:30 a.m. on January 27, 1955. Rubinstein returned to 814 Fifth Avenue, following a final public appearance at Nino's Continental Restaurant. He was accompanied by Estelle Gardner, a 30-year-old singer whose social utility to Rubinstein was that of a decorative escort. The dinner, consisting of steak Diane and premium Bordeaux, had cost $45, a sum representing $530 in 2026 purchasing power. After leaving Gardner at her apartment, Rubinstein entered his mansion alone. The entry process involved the mechanical engagement of a Yale and Town deadbolt, a high-security lock featuring a 5-pin tumbler system designed to resist standard lock-picking tools of the mid-century. However, the technical evidence suggested that the killers did not bypass this mechanism through force. They either possessed a duplicated key, a technical feat involving the impressioning of the original, or they were admitted by someone already within the mansion's internal perimeter. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the intruders reached the third-floor master suite. The technical execution of the binding was professional and calculated. The killers utilized white cotton Venetian blind cord, a 1/8-inch braided sash cord with a breaking strength of approximately 150 pounds. This material was common in mid-century New York households, providing the murderers with an untraceable, non-specialized tool. Rubinstein's wrists were bound with 7 tight turns, secured with a series of half-hitch knots that tightened upon any struggle. His ankles were similarly lashed, and his neck was encircled by a length of the same cord, which was then connected to his wrists in a hog-tie configuration. This mechanical arrangement meant that any attempt to straighten his legs would result in self-strangulation. To ensure absolute silence, the killers applied 3-inch-wide industrial masking tape. This adhesive, a rubber-based resin on a crepe paper backing, was designed for high tensile sealing. The tape was wrapped multiple times around Rubinstein's head, covering his mouth and nose, leaving only a microscopic gap for air that eventually failed. The forensic investigation was led by Dr. Milton Helpern, the chief medical examiner of New York City and a pioneer in the technical field of legal medicine. The autopsy revealed the cause of death as asphyxia by strangulation and suffocation. Helpern noted the presence of petechial hemorrhages in the conjunctiva, the technical term for the rupture of small capillaries in the eyes due to increased cephalic venous pressure. The toxicology report, utilizing the Stas auto extraction method, identified therapeutic levels of seconal in Rubinstein's system, confirming that he was likely sedated and unable to offer significant resistance during the binding process. The NYPD's Technical Research Bureau utilized the benzidine test to detect latent blood traces, but the crime scene was sterile. The killers had left no biological signatures. The macroeconomic context of the 19th Precinct in 1955 was one of extreme class insulation. While New York was experiencing a 15% increase in petty larceny, a home invasion of a Fifth Avenue mansion was considered a statistical anomaly. The logistics of the investigation required the mobilization of over 100 detectives who began the technical task of cross-referencing the list of 2,000. This involved searching the mansion's reinforced steel safe, which contained Rubinstein's private dossiers. These files were organized with the precision of a corporate audit, detailing the technical vulnerabilities of his rivals. Detectives noted that several files related to high-ranking members of the New York Dockworkers Union and certain offshore banking associates were notably missing. The killers had not merely executed a man, they had performed a targeted data extraction. The wealth Rubinstein had used to purchase his safety had ultimately provided the blueprints for his destruction. The NYPD searched for fingerprints using the iodine fuming technique on the silk pajamas and the adhesive tape, but the killers had worn gloves made of high-density latex or thin leather, leaving no ridge detail. The logistics of the getaway were equally clean. The mansion sat on a stretch of Fifth Avenue that at 4:00 a.m. was poorly lit and lacked the municipal surveillance technology of the modern era. The only witness was the cold wind from Central Park, which carried the scent of the Ma Griff perfume from the vanity out into the night. By the time the butler, William Morter, entered the room at 8:00 a.m., the trail was cold. The killers had vanished into the 1955 morning, leaving behind a billionaire who had spent his life winning every game, only to be checkmated by a few yards of household cord and a strip of industrial tape. The police found the list of 2,000 names, but in the world Serge Rubinstein created, the perpetrator was not a person, but a collective consequence. The death of Serge Rubinstein triggered a logistical and legal crisis that would consume the New York Surrogates Court for over a decade. The probate process, the technical legal procedure of validating a will and distributing assets, was immediate and chaotic. Rubinstein's estate was valued at a gross sum of $35 million in 1955. In 2026, this represents a liquid purchasing power of approximately $410 million. However, the net estate was a moving target. Because Rubinstein had utilized a labyrinth of cross-collateralized shell companies, the actual ownership of his assets was buried under layers of corporate technicality. The public administrator of New York County was appointed as the temporary executor, tasked with the asset inventory of 814 Fifth Avenue. This required the physical appraisal of every item, from the 17th century Isfahan rugs to the solid gold bathroom fixtures. The macroeconomic reality of inheritance in 1955 involved a federal estate tax rate that climbed as high as 77% for estates exceeding $10 million. To avoid this massive fiscal evaporation, Rubinstein's legal counsel, led by Edwin Chinland, attempted to prove that the majority of the assets were technically owned by Panamanian corporations. This initiated a technical battle with the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, over the piercing of the corporate veil, a legal doctrine used to ignore a corporation's separate identity and hold the shareholders personally liable. While the lawyers argued, the physical assets were liquidated. The 1952 Cadillac Fleetwood was sold at auction, and the 90-foot yacht, the Nam Sang, was seized to pay for outstanding dockage fees and crew wages. The logistics of the sale of the Nam Sang required a specialized maritime auctioneer. The vessel, which had cost $100,000 to build, was sold for a mere $40,000, $470,000 today, reflecting the stigma discount associated with the Rubinstein name. In 1957, the Parque Bernet Galleries, the precursor to Sotheby's in New York, conducted the auction of the mansion's contents. The technical cataloging of the art collection revealed that Rubinstein possessed several Dutch masters, including a landscape attributed to Meindert Hobbema. The auction was a social event of morbid curiosity. The Louis XV Boiserie was dismantled and sold to a developer for use in a new luxury hotel in Miami. The Isfahan rug that had muffled the butler's footsteps on the morning of the murder was sold for $2,500, $29,000 today. The logistics of the auction were a final liquidation of the golden lifestyle, turning his personal treasures into rows of numbered lots. The archive curiosities of the probate files show that Rubinstein's collection of 400 silk ties was sold as a single lot to a secondary market haberdasher for less than 10% of their original value. The mansion at 814 Fifth Avenue itself met a fate typical of the shifting Manhattan real estate landscape. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Manhattanization of Fifth Avenue saw many Gilded Age mansions demolished to make way for high-density luxury apartment cooperatives. These co-ops represented a new technical model of ownership, where residents owned shares in a corporation that owned the building rather than the physical units themselves. The Indiana limestone fortress of Serge Rubinstein was eventually demolished. The logistics of the demolition involved the manual removal of the facade and the jackhammering of the reinforced steel safe that Serge had believed was impregnable. Today, a modern glass and steel structure stands in its place, with no plaque to mark the site of the city's most infamous unsolved homicide. Rubinstein's heirs, his ex-wife Alice and his two daughters, spent years in a war of attrition over the remaining trust funds. After the IRS and the lawyers took their share, the $35 million fortune had dwindled significantly. The technical distribution of the funds was governed by the 1950s rule against perpetuities, which prevented property from being tied up in a trust for too long. By 1970, the Rubinstein name had faded from the financial columns. The man who had once manipulated the economies of nations and escaped the collapse of empires left behind a legacy of ruined assets. The unsolved nature of his murder remains a technical void in the NYPD's historical archives. The case was never closed, but it was eventually filed away, a victim of its own complexity and the lack of a sympathetic victim. Serge Rubinstein died as a man without a country, and he remains a man without a grave that anyone visits. His true monument was not the mansion on Fifth Avenue, but the list of 2,000 names, a testament to a life spent converting human relationships into tactical liabilities. The final audit of his life reveals a singular, unchanging truth about the era of gold. The architecture of greed is always designed with a flaw that allows the shadow to enter. Serge Rubinstein died as he lived, surrounded by the most absolute luxury, but without a single friendly hand to untie the knots that led him into the abyss.